Tomas, I'll just give you a quick introduction to Tomas. I know Tomas 100 years. The kitchen's looking good, all right, Peter. Thank you very much, Tomas. I know Tomas since I was about 17 or 18. We did a course in Dublin together, and then we worked together in Wexford, and now we're working in Tralee together. But we were always into adventuring, but it's great that he is going to talk to us tonight about skiing over Bothnia Bay. But I'll hand over to Tomas, and if anybody has any questions, please put a text into the chat box. So hopefully you can see that. So it's the bottom right-hand corner where the purple tab is. Click on that if you can't see the text box already, and it'll open. And if you want full screen, just close that purple tab. So if you want to see the slide almost in full screen, just tap on that purple tab on the right-hand side on the bottom corner. All right, Tomas, the floor is yours, my friend.
Fair play, Karen. Thanks very much. And I kind of almost feel like I'm in Kinvara with Karen. Anytime I've been up there with her, there's always been traditional music. And I actually had to send a special request when Marie-Louise was going to the shops today to say I needed to get one of these, because I don't think I've ever been in Kinvara with Karen and not had one of these. So sláinte, Karen, and thank you so much for organising this evening.
Sláinte too, Tomas.
Okay. Well, welcome everybody. I see you've organised a phenomenal number of people. I think there's about 38 or 39 different people who've dropped into us this evening, and you're all terribly welcome. I hope this works out well for you. As Karen mentioned, there is a chat function there that you can pop up your comments if you want to at any stage. Just the way this thing is set up, everybody is logged in as a presenter, so that gives you control over everything. But what I would ask you is maybe not to go advancing the slides, because somebody else might be watching it, and if you advance the slides, it'll move the slides for everybody. So maybe if you just leave it to Karen or myself to move those. Okay, so I think we were aiming for about half an hour or so of slides and talk and chat about a little trip that myself and my colleague Aidan from Clarny took just at the start of March. In fact, I suppose it was the second week of March. We started on the 8th, and it was an interesting time because obviously Europe was in the start of the grip of COVID-19, and we were finding ourselves watching or listening to the news and watching our text messages, etc., to find out what was going on in the outside world. So there was something slightly surreal about being alone on the ice, just the two of us for 5.5 days, but at the same time terribly connected with what was going on throughout Europe. So you can see there on the first slide, Karen has listed out the different slideshows that are going to be on over the next couple of weeks, and a couple of them connect with what we're doing. So, for instance, skiing across Arctic Norway that Brooke Nolan is doing in a couple of weeks' time. And I suppose maybe to start and to maybe explain where this came from as an idea. I had been bringing groups up to Arctic Finland for a number of years, actually for about 12 or 13 years from IT Tralee, where Karen and I work. And somebody had mentioned to me about skiing across Bothnia, Bothnia being the bay at the top of the Baltic Sea that separates Finland from Sweden. And you can see it in this night of Luleå. And the blue dot is the city of Kemi in Finland. And our proposal was to try and ski across between the two of them. It's about 130 kilometers across, and it generally, as you can see from the satellite picture, it freezes in the winter. So this is the normal freeze. So this is from the Finnish Met Office, and it indicates. This is from the Finnish Met Office, and it indicates that you get a freeze throughout the northern Bothnia Sea, the northern Baltic Sea and the Bay of Bothnia, with ice extending from 30 to 65 centimeters in depth. And this is indicated from the start of March. So the values that are given here are based on the previous 20-year averages. So the problem we had was this was the ice chart for January this year. So the white area in the Gulf is water, 2 degrees water, 2 degrees Celsius. The green area is brash ice, very rough ice. And the grey area is the only what's called fast ice or solid ice that we would be fit to travel on. So the week that we were actually traveling out, that was open, and around the edges between 20 and 60 centimeters of ice. So I had done a fair bit of research about the trip beforehand. There's very little written about it online. There were some Spanish guys who made a crossing in 2004, and I'd seen some information from them. And Tornio, which is near Kemi, I had some contacts there with the Finnish university that we work with quite a bit. So I contacted a colleague, Jussi, up there, Jussi Mutari, and he said, he wrote back saying, yeah, I think it's a good trip, but he did say, the only thing I'm concerning about are the big river ends which need to be crossed as far out as possible. And I'm not 100% sure about icebreakers. He says, but there shouldn't be any regular boats running into Luleå and Kalix, 2 of the big ports. Ice will be thick enough for skiing, he said. Oh, that's right. Anyway, so yeah, my colleague Jussi was suggesting that the ice would be good enough for skiing, but you need to be careful because he said, if the ice breaks under skis, it means it's really, really thin, which means that when you're trying to climb out, your weight will probably break through the ice again, and that will make it really difficult. So this didn't exactly inspire me when he said this. So here's a map showing our crossing. So it's showing Luleå down on the left-hand side, over to Kemi on the top right-hand side. And actually just north of Luleå, you'll notice that there's an interesting small town called Brandon. And we were very tempted to go and visit there, not just because of the name, but also because they had some nice, wonderful luxury cabins. But seeing as how it was early on in the trip, we decided we would behave ourselves and keep going and stick with our camping. So in terms of traveling and where we were going to go, as I said, there was limited information about it. The 2 Spanish guys who crossed the Baltic in 2003 made a video and put it on YouTube. Now, I shared all the information I was planning with the trip with Aidan, my friend who was traveling with me, but I kind of judiciously chose not to share this video with him because it showed horrendous scenes of the guys scrambling over open ice, having their camp woke in the middle of the night as an icebreaker passes 100 meters away from the tent, and eventually being so scared that they didn't even camp, they just bivouacked at night. So talking of my partner in crime for this, so this is Aidan Ford and myself on a ski tour in Austria. Yeah, so for our crossing from Luleå to Kemi, the area in the red circle was the only area that we had a real concern about, and the real concern related to icebreakers, because there's a lot of icebreaker activity in this area. There's a big oil refinery, I think there's a smelter, and then there's a tourist icebreaker. And while the boats going to the oil refinery and the industrial area would obviously follow just a straight line, the tourist icebreakers could be going absolutely anywhere. And that was a bit of a concern for us. So in planning out the trip, we managed to download maps, excellent maps from the Cartographic Association in Sweden, and we were able to drop a grid onto the map to make it easier for keeping track of where we were going and for taking bearings. The maps were generally 1:100,000, because with 135 kilometers we would have just needed too many maps to carry. So we ended up with 1 or 2 1:50,000 maps, and mostly 1 is to 100,000 map. So as I said, my partner in crime for this was Aidan Ford, and this was the second ski trip that we had done together. This was us previously in Austria. And there's Aidan, who's a very active member of Kerry Mountain Rescue, and there he is on the right-hand side on our Austrian trip. One of the things that's interesting about this photograph here, I noted afterwards, I think apart from the hat, the clothes we were wearing on this trip in 2016 are pretty much exactly the clothes we were wearing on this trip. So we're not exactly fashion aficionados. We just seem to use the same clothes for all our trips. But it was kind of ironic looking at photos from the two trips that we were dressed absolutely identically. So our trip started on a very kind of damp day in Kemi, in the city of Kemi. So I had been working with IT Tralee and Humak University of Applied Science in Finland with a joint trip in eastern Finland. And so when my students were traveling back to Ireland, I took the 5.5-hour train journey up to Finnish Lapland and met Aidan at the train station. He had just flown in from Ireland. And the next rather damp day, we headed off by bus to Sweden. Now, for a number of trips that I've done in the Arctic, I've hired very, very nice pulks, very nice sleds for traveling over snow and ice, and really nice lightweight fiberglass and carbon fiber with fiberglass poles. That means that you can steer them from the front, and some of them even have ski base built into the bottom of them in order to make them run nice and fast. These are not those kind of sleds. We looked at the option of getting them hired and couriered up to us, but I had noted in a big kind of utility store in Finland called Tokarami. It's a best description I could give it as being like Michael Guiney's from Finland, and they had fishing pulka. So these would be large pulkas that are sleds that are used by fishermen going out to go ice fishing. And so on our first morning in Kemi, we nipped over to the local Tokarami, managed to pick up 2 sleds straight away, €40 a piece, did all our shopping in Lidl, which was next door, and by 11 o'clock we were packed, organised and ready to go to Sweden. So it was a kind of a miserable day with the weather hovering around 0, and the ice on the paths was absolutely treacherous. In fact, we actually just packed up our sleds with everything and pulled them across the ice on the roads and footpaths over to the bus station to start the journey over to Sweden. So there's lots of interesting things to see on the way over, traveling for a couple of hours by road. One of the interesting things, my daughter, who's a total fan of Frozen, when I told her what I was going to do, was asking me constantly, was I going to see Anna or Elsa or any of the rest of the cast from Frozen? So I didn't want to disappoint her. So if you keep your eyes open, you never know. You might actually spot the odd character from Frozen. So our journey went from Kemi over to Tornio, which is on the Finnish-Swedish border. And at that point, we had to change bus in a most unusual bus station, a bus station which sits right on the border. And it did occur to me that if the UK continue with their plans to stop doing if the European Union go ahead with their idea of not doing summertime, and we could end up with a situation where Newry and Dundalk are on 2 different time zones, it would look a bit like this. So this is the bus station, and literally all the timetables are up on one side in Finnish with Finnish times, and all the other ones are on the other side with Swedish times. So you could very easily miss your bus. Anyway, coronavirus was very much on people's minds in Sweden as we entered the country. and lots of notices and signs like this just to remind us that a pandemic had started in Europe. So our bus journey brought us over to Luleå, to the city. I think Aidan told me it has quite a large population, I think around 100,000 if I'm correct. And a short taxi ride from the middle of the city brought us out to a marina. And we literally stepped out of the marina, put our skis on the ground and skied away. There was no organizing or anything to do. We were ready to go. We were looking out across the bay and figuring out how we were going to be navigating our way. Aidan stepped out onto the ice just to give it a good kick with his Wellington boots and make sure that it was actually strong enough to walk on. And then off we went. So I suppose at this stage it was probably about 3:30 or 4 in the afternoon. So we knew we would only go a few kilometers that evening to a campsite, and we had chosen a small island about 4 or 5 kilometers away. So one of the things that has to be noted about the Gulf of Bothnia, as the northern part of the Baltic is called, is that it's an incredible archipelago of islands. There are hundreds and hundreds of islands. And our plan was to travel across the sea ice from Luleå to Kemi, but to stay on the islands as much as we could. We were very much mindful of the advice from Mike Shea from Dingle, who has done a number of journeys on ice and who had pointed out that getting a restful night's sleep while your tent is lying on ice, which is cracking and groaning and creaking underneath you, is not very conducive to a good night's sleep. So our first camp was on this small island. I can't even recall the name of it, but we arrived just in time to see the sun setting and a beautiful, I think it's called a gibbon moon, very, very full moon just coming up. I suppose one of the things about our journey was that we were pulling these sleds, so we had a capacity to carry our food and things for a number of days, but we didn't have a huge capacity to carry water. And while there was lots of snow around, there was no flowing water. So all our water had to be melted snow. So we lit fires most evenings, and we had brought along a very nice kettle, which had a big volume, which made it perfect for boiling up snow, and created a nice kind of atmosphere in the evening time. So we woke up to a lovely morning the following morning, blue skies and sunshine. The occluded front that had been the day before had passed through, and we were looking out at this vista. So our exit out of this bay here was basically out this area here. We were going to head out through there. Now, I see Larkin MacDonald had popped in and out there. Larkin, I was thinking very much of at this time because he and I had done a journey a number of years ago in central Finland on a very large lake that had over 900 islands. And navigating in terrain with low islands, where they're all covered in forest, is surprisingly complicated. And the islands tend to merge into each other, and the navigation becomes quite tricky. So for the first couple of days, we didn't have too much trouble, but later on, as the weather became poorer and okay, smashing. So there we go, heading off on our second day, dragging these nice pulks behind us. So as we headed across this lovely white snow, the snow in front of us, or the ice in front of us, seemed to get very, very blue, incredibly bright blue. And in fact, what we were seeing was reflection of the beautiful blue sky off the surface of the ice. And you can see in this picture here the variety of ice that was there. So we had snow cover on the ice. We had that kind of grey ice that's there to the left, and we also had pure watery kind of blue ice. And the latter was the more challenging because that very clear blue ice often had water forming on it in the previous days, and then it would freeze at night. So you would have maybe, we were hoping, 40 or 50 centimeters of ice, followed by a few inches of water, followed by maybe 3 or 4 centimeters of ice on top. So that gives you the reassurance that there's lots of ice underneath you, between you and the sea. But when you're skiing over it, it tends to flex, it tends to crack, and it tends to make a whole variety of noises that, well, it does nothing for your wits, never mind your control on your sphincter muscles. So on that second day, we had one large area which seemed to have been blown clear completely of snow. Now, the challenge with that is that the skis are very grippy when they're on snow, but not so grippy when they're on ice. They have nice long metal edges on them, but they don't necessarily catch on the base. Now, we had planned for this, and we did actually bring ice spikes which we could fit to our boots at any stage. But the challenge then is all your body weight is spread over the sole of your foot, which is a much smaller area to spread on thin ice than the length of your ski. So we decided to just continue pottering across the ice here, and used a variety of different techniques. I was in full-on wheelchair mode, imagining pushing, sitting in a wheelchair and doing a double arm push as a method of propelling myself across. It was absolutely stunning in terms of the views, but a bit unnerving with the noise that was coming from underfoot. I suppose the only positive thing for me was I'm maybe 5 or 6 kilos less than Dr. Ford. So where I skipped across some places, somebody else found themselves with the ice cracking just a little bit more underneath them. Thankfully, after about another 5 or 6 kilometers, that area of bare ice finished, and we were back onto snow, and we were very, very relieved to be back on snow. But we were quite mindful that the areas to our south were closer to the edge of the ice shelf, and therefore more prone to these kind of conditions. And so we became quite mindful of trying to travel island to island with relatively short hops between them. And so the next number of islands we traveled short hops of maybe 2 to 3 kilometers between each island, and tried to avoid long passages where we could see glassy sections ahead of us. Now, being ice moves, ice expands, and being on top of the sea and the whole thing is moving, you do get cracks. Now, again, from watching the 2 Spanish guys, we saw that they had a lot of ice ridges and really difficult formations in the ice. Thankfully, we didn't experience that, but we did see these large fissures and cracks going across, just to remind us that we weren't in a field covered in snow, but actually over water. The light was particularly gorgeous that day, and it was full on sunblock and sunglasses and stuff to make sure that we weren't going to get burnt. The breeze that did pop up every now and then, though, was kind of chilly, and we were glad that the day had started a good few degrees below freezing, because we didn't want any of these watery areas on the top that now had a reassuring layer of ice. We didn't want them melting on us. So toward the end of this section, which was, I think we did about 20 or 24k this day, we came in towards this island, and even though it was only about 2:30 in the afternoon, we decided it was really time to get off the ice and not to be out on these large wet sections as the melt started in the later afternoon. And so we approached this small island, which I think afterwards turned out to be part of a nature reserve. Now, one of the things we were kind of conscious of in camping in this area and lighting fires was not to try and do any damage to the area. So thankfully, there was a very good amount of standing dead wood that we were able to use for making fires. And generally, what we did is we actually lit the fires out on the ice or just on the edge of the ice, so that it wasn't going to burn down into the soil and vegetation that was underneath. And here we were at that fire. Actually, the interesting thing, we had noted that there was a weather front coming in, and you can just about see over at the top here, there was this large fog bank. I mean, this fog bank was several kilometers wide, and in the space of an hour, it went from this, which was lovely, very pleasant afternoon sunshine, to fog and damp and cold, with the temperature just below freezing. So here's our fire just on the edge of the ice sheet. One of the things that was particularly uncomfortable about this campsite was that there was a really cold breeze blowing, and it was quite uncomfortable to sit by the fire. You could be warm on one side, but completely freezing on the other. And so we put up a tarpaulin to try and protect us from the wind, which was coming from the right-hand side here. But the most amazing thing, which I had never seen happen before, we got this amazing vortex of wind, where the wind was actually whipping over the tarp and causing a circulation and actually sucking the smoke into underneath the tarpaulin, to the point where it was impossible to sit there, and we ended up just taking the tarpaulin down. Again, the ice was reminding us that it was a living thing, a moving thing. And as our camp was quite close to the ice this night, I do recall hearing a lot of creaking and groaning and cracking as the ice was expanding in the nighttime, as the temperature dropped and the whole thing started to move a little bit. So this is looking in toward our campsite again, in one of those large kind of fissures across the ice. So I suppose we were 2 days into the trip at this stage, and we had 2 very pleasant camps. The weather had been very good to us so far, but of course, weather isn't something that stays the same. And so the next day when we headed off, it was a much grayer day. We had a large section of more glassy ice to cross, and we started to meet the first navigation marks of our journey. So these large beacons for sailors and people navigating are floating, but have obviously been completely surrounded by the ice. And both Aidan sails a lot, and I've sailed a bit in the past, so we were quite used to seeing these kind of marks, but it was quite surreal to be going past them on skis. Well, we didn't meet a whole lot of people at this stage. In fact, we didn't meet any people by this point, but we did see signs of life. On this third day, a lot of animal tracks. And these large droppings, not chocolate-covered raisins, but quite large. I mean, they were the size of a Brazil nut, not like your normal little pellets from a rabbit or a sheep or a deer. These were from a moose or elk. And so there were their tracks on the snow. And just to give you a scale on it, that's a single footprint beside my glove from an elk. So if you think about, if any of you who live in rural areas in Ireland where you'd see cow footprints, I mean, these are about 50% bigger than a cow print. We didn't actually see the elk, but we did see reindeer not long after this, in fact. And there's an interesting thing. Beside Aidan at this point, we saw Christmas trees. in a number of places, people who go from island to island, because there's a lot of summer cottages, or kind of, like we would have a mobile home in Banna Beach or up in Fenor or something like that. A lot of people have small cottages, little wooden cabins on the islands, and they would potter in and out to them in the summertime in boats, and in the wintertime they go back and forth on skidoos. And as the visibility can be quite poor, sometimes they put out a line of little fir trees or spruce trees to act as an aid to navigation as you go. So this was a particularly long day. I think we did 26 or 28 kilometers this particular day. Now, that's not a huge distance, but in fairness, we weren't out to have anything more than a trip or a holiday, so we weren't exactly looking to push ourselves. But dragging those sleds for that length of time was fine enough. I commented recently that they weighed, when they were full with food and fuel and stuff, probably 30 to 35 kilos each. So when it was on the snow, you could feel it a little bit. When it was on the more glassy ice, they were easier to pull along. So we did some of our longer open crossings on this day, crossings maybe 7 kilometers off from land, or from one point of land to the next. And this is just coming into our next campsite. And these kind of ridges of ice, we were debating a lot about the formation of these, whether they had been formed by brash ice early in the season, where ice forms on the surface and gets blown by the wind towards the shore, the lee shore, or else it was that the level of the Baltic had dropped and that these sections had kind of collapsed. Either way, we camped right beside it, and again, a fairly grey night, and it had been one of those days where the temperature was just below freezing, so everything felt very, very damp. The wood was damp, the fire was hard to light. I mean, it was a kind of a challenging evening for us. So this maybe might give you a bit of a perspective on our first couple of days. So this map is 1:100,000, and you can see the little yellow marks our first campsite here, our second campsite with that funny vortex of wind, and then this longish day up here with a long crossing across here to just before the end of this little peninsula here. Now, this little peninsula was kind of significant for us because the next bay was the one where most of the icebreaker activity was going to be, and we were conscious of trying to see how we were going to negotiate that. Well, here was one of our other inhabitants on the ice at this stage. We hadn't met anybody else at this stage, but we saw these rather large tracks. And I have to say, I'm not brilliant on tracks. It's definitely not a member of the deer family. The toes seem too wide for a member of the dog family, and the nail would indicate that it wasn't a cat. So I'm a bit flummoxed, but maybe at the end, if anybody has any suggestions or comments, we can throw that slide up again, and they can maybe guide us on it. So going around this end peninsula, we started to see more bits of water starting to stick out. Now, I was very keen to see how much ice was on top of it, and venturing over to the edge of it, I never saw any less than about 25 centimeters of ice before you saw water underneath. But yeah, we continued on, and again, past more navigation marks. You can see in the distance the weather was pretty horrid here. Aidan has his hood up. It was snowing on us for a lot of the day, and I got 2 phone calls at this point. One from my wife to tell me that they were closing the school and that our daughter was being sent home, and the second one was from Liam Calnan in Capnalee to tell me that they were being closed down and all the college's outdoor programs were being cancelled. So although I was on my holidays, I was still very conscious of what was happening at home, and and for everybody here in Ireland. So this is the bay that I was telling you about, you know, so we've come around that peninsula from Storen and up through the archipelago of islands towards Nyberg. And it was a day where it snowed on us for most of the day. It was difficult navigation. At one stage, we were using GPS, we were using maps, we were using Google Maps, and we were using potluck as well. We were using every kind of method to try and navigate through these tiny little maze of islands. We had intended going all the way around the coast and into Nyberg, but to try and avoid that bay, and as the evening was getting on, it was getting after 4, and in this part of Sweden it tended to be dark by 5:30. So we took a skidoo road into Nyberg village. Our plan was, because most of our kit was pretty wet at this stage, and seeing as how this wasn't a serious trip, just a holiday, we said we would pop into the nearest town and have a nice meal, a hotel, dry out, and then go back out to the ice. It also meant that we could, instead of trying to cross this bay where Karlsborg, the big marina was, that we could actually go around it. Now, this is where it's interesting that this port was called Karlsborg, because we were joking at different stages saying if Karlsborg, you know, like the ad on the television, if Karlsborg did ski trips, this was the ski trip, because everything had worked so well for us. And literally, as we walked off the snowmobile trail onto the first road we came to in Nyberg, and we were trying to figure out how we would get a taxi to come about 20 kilometers from the nearest town, along came a bus and carted us out of there straight away, which was wonderful, absolutely wonderful. So again, this was the reason we were trying to avoid the next bay was this boat here, the Polar Explorer. The Polar Explorer is a tourist icebreaker, and it wanders around the bay, cracking up the ice for the amusement of the tourists, and stopping so that people can step out on the ice. Apart from looking at maps, we were also watching Baltice, this Baltic icebreaking management website, which was showing us where the traffic was. So if I was to indicate that this was Luleå where we started, and it showed a number of boats in the port here, this was the peninsula that we had just rounded, and this pink color is indicating weak or gray ice, and this is Karlsborg, the big port, and this port here is where the tourist boat goes in and out. So with a combination of boats here, we saw that it was going to be pretty sensible to go into Nyberg, flash up to the town here, have an overnight, dry out our gear, and then come in on the other side of the bay and continue on our journey. So we were very lucky, as I say, literally a bus arrived the minute we stepped onto the public road, and you know, bus drivers in European countries are not like Irish bus drivers. They're not used to bending rules, and this would be considered the kind of cargo that you're not supposed to throw in a bus. But this incredibly helpful bus driver was only delighted to take them in. It turned out he was an Irish whiskey aficionado, had been to Dublin on whiskey tastings in the previous month, and literally dropped us within 100 meters of our hotel. So this was us very happy on the bus. So the next day, with all our kit dry, we took a bus down to Nikola, which was the next kind of accessible point to get back on the bay. And this map shows our route where we went from Nikola across and crossed back into Finland. Now, the red area indicates where the big oil terminal, another big oil terminal was, and there was a lot of traffic in and out of this one. And so we weren't going to be able to travel south and around it like this, because we would definitely be hitting icebreaker traffic here. But we managed to find a load of small channels, and and lakes that connected, and marshes and bogs that connected right through the back of the peninsula and down into a nature reserve down here. And so we managed to follow this route and stay with a sense of wilderness, even though we were right beside this enormous factory and wind farm. So there we are, getting dropped off by our bus and heading out onto the ice. So it was about -6 or -8 this day, but extremely windy. And so the wind chill was quite severe. And I think we both had quite cold fingertips on this particular day. So lots of islands to pass, and we started doing slightly longer open crossings again, heading towards this. This is where the oil refinery, or the big factory is, and the big wind farm, big industrial area. And we were going to go to the north of that and through those lakes and marshes and down to the nature reserve. So again, I suppose you could say there's a terrible sameness about much of the scenery. But as anyone who knows the west of Ireland and the way scenery goes and the way light goes, every time the light changes, the scenery changes. So finally, we crossed back into Finland, and these locals had their flags out to remind us that we had crossed over the border again, and we were coming close to civilization, but not actually completely into towns or villages. We meandered our way through these kind of green spaces, sometimes having to cross over a road, sometimes over a railway track, and then into a marsh or bog on the other side. Finally, we found our way to one of these, which is a lavu, which is a kind of a lean-to shelter for picnicking, which the equivalent of the National Trust put out in Finland in all their recreation areas. And it formed a beautiful last evening for us in the outdoors. We had a lovely fire and a lovely evening, drying out, eating lots of food, an extraordinary concoction of food. It was one of those things where when you're on your last 2 days of the trip, you try and eat your way through all your stores so you don't have to actually carry it anymore. And one of the things that we got to do every evening as well, because we had a fire, was to dry out our boots. Obviously, in these kind of temperatures, to do 5 or 6 days without getting to dry your boots would be kind of challenging and uncomfortable. So the next day, I came across some more tracks, and I had come across wolf tracks in eastern Finland before, but I'm not quite sure that these were wolf tracks. I think they might have been more like a big Labrador, but I'm not sure. I'm open to correction on that. The toes look good for wolf, but I think the pads are not quite the right shape. Maybe somebody else will have an opinion on this. So our last day was bringing us over to the horizon. So you can see the smoke here of the industries in Kemi. And there's more industries down here, down at the port. And basically this is where we were heading for the day. So about 20 or 22 kilometers run for our last leg. So it was a particularly beautiful day again. I think it was again, maybe 6 below and a strong breeze by times. Again, quite chilly on the fingertips, and when we stopped to have a break for food or whatever, we really needed to find some shelter behind an island or something like that, because the wind was quite cutting. So this was our last day. So coming on from our little wilderness camp here in the nature reserve, and following the outside of a number of these islands. Now, it's very busy city up here and very industrial, but thankfully none of the boats seem to be going, none of the icebreakers seem to be going up at this time. So we meandered our way through these islands, and we're coming down here. Our aim was to try and literally come in to the bottom of the city down here, which would have put us about 200 meters from the hotel where we started. And it almost worked. We got very close to it, to about here, where there's a large cardboard factory, absolutely massive. I mean, it must have been 4 or 5 hectares of industrial unit. But unfortunately, when we came close to it, this is what greeted us: open water. And open water is not particularly something that you want to see when on a crossing like this. And so what we actually figured was happening was that the production in the cardboard factory was using water and firing thousands of gallons of warm water into the sea. And so it was melting a large area. Now, while we could see clearly where it was water, and we could see where there was thin ice, we couldn't see how far out the thin ice extended. Though Aidan sensibly offered that we could go out a couple of 100 meters, maybe half a kilometer, and see, I was thinking maybe we should take a different route. So we backtracked a little bit and found another pathway which brought us up to a road, and a taxi ride got us back to the middle of Kemi City. So then we had the whole surreal thing of being in a hotel room and connecting with everything that was happening in Ireland, and trying to get ourselves back to Ireland. Finnair had just announced that it was going to ground all its aircraft in the coming days. And so we got a flight down from Lapland back to Helsinki, an hour and a half, and eventually back to Dublin Airport, which was like a ghost town, where there was one baggage carousel running. And thankfully, our very awkward and strange-looking baggage got great service from the baggage handlers there, and we were out of the airport very quickly. So that's pretty much our trip. Thank you. I hope you enjoyed it. As Karen says, if anybody has any questions, ask away for Tom Hanrahan.
Tomas, that was brilliant. Thanks a million. It's brilliant to see the different terrain and topography over there in the ice lands of Finland. And I loved all your little cartoony characters from Frozen. I don't have children, so I don't recognize them as easily as many people. But if anyone has any questions, do you want to just flick them into the text box, and Tomas will answer them. And while people are doing that, if I could just promote for next week, we have talks for the next 6 weeks. So good on you, Joanna. For the next 6 weeks, next week is May Buchana, so they're going to be talking about travels west around the world. So basically they started in Ireland and then headed west, and they went through America and Asia, etc., etc., etc. So please tune in again next week as well. And if there are any questions there for you, Tomas? There you go. One from Lauren.
Thanks very much. So there's one from Nikki first. Why would I want to do it? I'm not really quite sure. And to be honest, it was something that was in my mind for probably 5 or 6 years, but I can't actually remember how it came into my mind. I think I had met somebody who had done it or had done part of it. But I don't recall completely why. It just captured my imagination. And though Karen has warned me not to go all green and talk about the depressions of climate change, I mean, you probably saw in those pictures early on the amount of sea ice that's normally there and the amount of ice that's there at the moment. It's not good. I mean, the subarctic regions, countries like Finland, Sweden, Norway, northern Canada, across into Russia, these places are seeing climate change to a much greater degree than we are at our latitudes. And I just did think, you know, in a couple of years' time, maybe there won't be an opportunity to do this kind of crossing. Now, sorry, somebody else had a question there. What was the distance? Yeah, so it's about 135 kilometers, and I think we skipped out about 25 kilometers in the middle. So it was, I have to say, it was a holiday. You know, really, it wasn't, apart from the odd sphincter clenching moment with cracking ice, it was a very pleasant trip, lovely camping and great company. How different was it to the lakes in Finland in terms of trekking across? Well, in some regards, Larkin, it was very similar to stuff that we would have done up in towards Halti and up at the Norwegian border. I suppose the difference was maybe just the way sometimes you got a layer of ice, then maybe 3 centimeters, 4 centimeters thick, and then water underneath, and then ice underneath it again. Yeah, there was phone. Yes, Maeve, there was phone coverage all the time. I mean, the Finns were very much leaders in the technology for mobile phones originally, in terms of, like, Nokia is a Finnish brand, Finnish city actually as well. And a lot of the networks that are rolled out across the country are there. Now, we were flitting between Swedish networks and Finnish networks, but we never really had any problems getting coverage. What did we use for food and meals, Jammer? Most important question. Dehydrated? Absolutely not. I mean, we went with vegetables. We brought some meat. Actually, I had a lovely meal one day, which was a bean stew, which I think had actually been made by Dave McCormack up on our trip with the students, and I had carried it from the week before. I mean, yeah, we bought fresh fruit and vegetables. We brought dried fruit and nuts. The national food, obviously, in Ireland, you might think of Irish stew and potatoes and things. The national food in Finland is rye bread. So we had the most fabulous rye bread all the time. And we brought things like eggs and stuff like that as well. How many hours of daylight did we have each day? Well, we were getting up about 6 or 6:30 every day. If my memory serves me right, we were trying to I think we got moving by about 7:30. So it was bright from about 6. And then on the Swedish side, it tended to get dark by about 5:30, and it was kind of 6:30 on the Finnish side. Are you backwinding? Yeah. Yes, sailing below a cliff. Yeah, I can imagine. Yeah. I'd never actually experienced that before. Now, Aidan did tell me the technical name for it, being a engineer and an owner of a wind farm. He knew exactly the process that was going on. I understood the concept in terms of eddies from rivers, but I'd never seen it happen with smoke like that before. Is that a giant cheese pawn on my... No, that is a lamp. That is your best IKEA lamp. Any problems with power packs and phones in the cold? No. We both had power packs, all right. And I tell you, it's amazing. Android phones just last for days and days on charge. So no, I mean, we carried the phones, and in our clothes, in our jacket pockets. We carried the power packs in our rucksacks on our backs, so they were close to our backs, and getting warmth from those. I tended to put them in the sleeping bag at night to make sure that they didn't freeze on any other battery products that we had, because definitely cold does cause them to leach, all right. Somewhere else in mind. Yeah. I don't know, Larkin. I haven't thought about it. Yeah, haven't thought. Actually, where it would be nice to go would be in Canada, perhaps. Maybe in Ontario. There's a couple of big bays there. But it was really nice. And I'm just thinking again, Larkin, about that trip we did up towards Kilpisjärvi and the Norwegian-Finnish border. It was wonderful to spend 5.5 days ski touring and not to have to go up one hill. There's something absolutely brilliant about skiing on the flat. And Tom Hanrahan is reminding me, about the snow-clad road between Ashford and Lara. Now, Tom Hanrahan and I did probably my first ski tour ever. If I could think what year it was, I would say it was January 1985, and I was mitching off school and skiing from Ashford to Glyn, to Glendalough, to Glenmalure, and got into serious trouble with my mother, who had to write a note feigning some kind of illness that I hadn't been in school. And no, it wasn't yesterday. Now, did I miss anyone else's questions? Did you need to train in advance? Well, that's a good question, Annette. I certainly didn't. I did absolutely nothing. Nothing at all. Zero, I'm afraid. Yeah, I probably should have. But in fairness, it was rather leisurely. So we weren't killing ourselves. Northern Lights. Yeah. So we did see one evening where there might have been something active in the sky, not the kind of really class ones you see further north in Lapland. And I did check there's a little app you can get for your phone from the Finnish Met Service that tells you the likelihood of Northern Lights. And we had a beautiful evening at that Lavu, and I just thought, wouldn't it be great to just top it off if we were doing if Carlsberg did ski tours? And looked out to the northeast, and there was this pattern in the sky. Went off, did something else, came back, and the pattern had changed. So I gave Aidan a shout, and we both looked at it for a while and tried to persuade ourselves that it was Northern Lights. I think it was, but it wasn't very good. It wasn't as good, certainly, as you see up around Akaslampolo and those areas to the north. No questions about toileting. Good stuff. Well, now, thank you, or #2, whatever that is. So, yeah, generally, I would have done lots of tours with student groups, and we tend to always choose campsites where there are composting toilets, wilderness campsites. So we literally camp at places where there's a composting toilet available. In this place, we couldn't. So we combined a couple of different techniques. Sometimes we just did our best to clear snow, or to use areas where there was lots of rocks, for instance, and to snuggle in behind rocks where we might be able to bury stuff. But like burying in this kind of climate, I mean, it's just going to freeze and stay there for a long time. There is another technique that sea kayakers use in a leave no trace context, which is called a ship put, which I tried to persuade Aidan to the merits of, but he very sensibly took no notice. So basically, you whatever you're leaving behind, you try and deposit on a large flat stone, and then you have a go at becoming part of the Irish shot put team and fire it out toward the water. The only problem with doing that, while it works really well in the context of being on the liquid sea, when you're on the frozen sea and you've lots of mammals like the elk and the reindeer wandering out, it's not much good. So yeah, I'm afraid we did the best we could, is the answer to that.